The church bells tolled like iron shackles, each chime sealing her fate. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the veil was lowered over her face, blurring the world into a ghostly haze. The scent of wilted roses clung to the air, masking the sweat and dust of the crowded frontier chapel. Outside, the desert wind howled against the wooden walls like a caged beast, as if nature itself protested the union. She gripped her hands tight, knuckles white, while her father's stern voice echoed in her ears, "You'll do as you're told. This marriage saves the ranch." But Clara's heart was not hers to give not anymore. Her gaze swept over the small wooden pews filled with ranchers, townsfolk, and women dressed in stiff prairie dresses. They whispered and gossiped, but their eyes gleamed with satisfaction. To them, this was not a wedding. It was a business deal, a merger of land and cattle. Clara's father had been drowning in debt ever since the drought took their crops, and the only lifeline had come from the man standing at the altar, Hiram Lawson, a cattle baron nearly twice her age. He was wealthy, powerful, and feared, and Clara loathed him. Lawson's face was ruddy from years of whiskey and sun, his lips curled in a permanent sneer. His thick fingers glistened with gold rings, and he wore his wealth as armor. He had never once looked at her with kindness, only possession. To him she was another prize, another asset to tighten his grip on the valley. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the preacher's droning words. She forced herself to breathe, but each inhale only brought more of the suffocating perfume, sweat and dust that clung to the air. She thought of running. She always thought of running, but her father's stern figure loomed in the front pew, eyes hard as stone, daring her to disobey. "You'll ruin us all if you falter," his expression warned. Clara's heart twisted, but it was not just fear that beat inside her. It was memory. She thought of another man, one who had never stood in a church or worn a suit, but whose presence carried the weight of mountains. His skin was bronze, his hair long and black as midnight, his eyes dark and steady like the desert before dawn. Cale. She had met him a year ago by accident, when her horse had spooked near the river and thrown her into the current. She had been moments from drowning when strong arms pulled her from the water. He had carried her ashore, his chest warm against her cheek, and laid her beneath the stars. She remembered the sound of his voice, low and steady in the Navajo tongue, though she barely understood the words. She remembered the fire he built, the way he stayed awake all night to guard her, and the way he vanished at dawn, leaving only a carved feather charm pressed into her palm. From that night on, she had dreamed of him. And though weeks passed into months, their paths crossed again and again in the market, at the river, in fleeting stolen glances where the world seemed to fall away. No promises were spoken, but something deeper bound them together, something stronger than law or land. Now, standing at the altar, Clara's soul ached for him. She scanned the back of the chapel, half expecting, half praying, to see his silhouette appear against the doorway. The preacher's words blurred together, lawful wedded wife, honor and obey. And she felt the room closing, and Lawson reached for her hand, his grip like iron, and she flinched. His thumb dug into her skin as though testing a horse's reins. The crowd leaned forward, eager for the vows, the kiss, the sealing of the deal. But then, through the hum of voices and the rattling of windows from the desert wind, she felt it. Presence. Her heart leapt into her throat as the heavy doors at the back of the church creaked open. Every head turned. The storm outside wailed louder, swirling dust into the doorway. And there, silhouetted against the dying sun, stood a figure broad-shouldered and unyielding, his hair whipping in the wind, the glint of tribal jewelry flashing across his chest. Cale. The air shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd, half awe, half fear. The Navajo warrior stepped forward, his boots striking the wooden floor like thunder, his dark eyes locked not on the preacher, not on her father, not on the groom, but on Clara. First time all evening she could breathe, and in that moment she knew her wedding night would not belong to Hiram Lawson. It would belong to the man who had come to claim her. The chapel froze. Every voice, every cough, every whispered breath seemed to vanish as Cale stood framed in the open doorway, the desert storm swirling around him. Dust and golden light streamed past his shoulders, casting him as something otherworldly, as if he were not a man at all but a spirit summoned by her desperate heart. His long black hair whipped in the wind, his bare chest carved in muscle, glinting with tribal jewelry that marked his people's pride and heritage. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Hiram Lawson's grip on her hand tightened until her fingers throbbed. His face turned red with fury, his jaw clenching so hard she could hear the grind of teeth. "What in God's name?" he spat, but the words cracked in the air like a whip, cutting short when Cale took a step inside. Boots struck wood, steady, deliberate, each one echoing in the silence. Gasps rose from the pews. Some women clutched their children close, as if the warrior's very presence threatened them. The men shifted uncomfortably, their hands twitching near their belts where pistols rested. Prejudice ran deep in this town, and to them, Cale was not just an intruder, he was a danger, a reminder that the frontier still belonged to people they tried to push aside. But Cale's eyes never left. Clara thought it was as if no one else in the chapel existed. His gaze was an anchor, holding her steady against the tide of fear and expectation pressing in from all sides. Her heart pounded not from dread but from the wild, reckless hope that surged through her veins. Hiram finally released her hand, shoving her arm away as though she carried disease. "Get him out of here," he barked, spittle flying from his lips. His men, the ranch hands he kept close as bodyguards, rose from the back pews, heavy boots thudding against the floor as they moved toward Cale. Cale did not flinch. Instead, he reached to the leather strap across his chest, fingers brushing the carved feather charm he had once given Clara. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted it for all to see, then pointed it toward her. A silent declaration. A claim made not with words but with memory, with fate. Clara's breath hitched, her knees weak. The symbol blazed in her mind. The night by the river, his hand pressing that same charm into her palm, the unspoken bond forged between them. Preacher stammered, his voice breaking through the heavy silence. This is holy ground. You have no place here, Navajo." But Cale did not speak. His silence was louder than any sermon. His presence alone filled the room with tension so thick it pressed against Clara's skin. Hiram's men reached him, broad shoulders squaring, hands hovering over revolvers. "Turn around, Redskin," one snarled. "You got no business here." Cale's jaw tightened, but still he stood calm, unmoved, as if their threats were nothing but buzzing flies. Then, finally, his voice came low, resonant, carrying the weight of the desert wind. "She is not his," he said, his English rough but clear. His dark eyes cut toward Hiram, then back to Clara. "She is mine." A collective gasp shook the chapel. Women gasped aloud, men cursed under their breath, and the preacher nearly dropped his Bible. Clara's heart felt as though it might tear free from her chest. She wanted to scream, to cry, to rush to him, but her father's glare pinned her to the spot. His face was white with fury, jaw set like granite, his hand gripping the arm of the pew until his knuckles blanched. "You'll shame this family, girl." His look warned, but shame was nothing compared to a lifetime chained to Hiram Lawson. Lawson himself roared with laughter, though the sound was jagged, forced. "Yours?" he bellowed. "You think you can walk into my church on my wedding day and take what's mine?" His hand shot to his hip, drawing the revolver that gleamed at his side. "I'll skin you alive before I let that happen." Before the barrel could rise, Cale moved. Like lightning he closed the distance, one powerful hand snapping forward to grip Lawson's wrist. The gun clattered to the floor, metal ringing against wood. In the same motion, Cale shoved him back, sending the cattle baron crashing against the altar rail. Shouts erupted. The crowd surged with panic. Women screamed. Men stumbled over pews. Children cried as chaos swallowed the chapel. Clara's father lunged toward her, but Cale was faster. He reached her in 2 strides, his hand firm around her waist, pulling her against him. She gasped at the sudden strength of him, the heat of his skin, the way the storm seemed to follow wherever he stood. "You come," he said, his voice fierce, urgent. Clara's mind whirled, torn between fear and the wild exhilaration coursing through her. Behind them, Lawson cursed and scrambled for his pistol. The ranch hands shouted, fists flying as townsfolk scrambled to stop them. But in that chaos, in that storm of voices and violence, Clara made her choice. She clung to Cale, and together they fled through the doors into the roaring desert night. The desert swallowed them whole. The chapel's frantic cries faded into the wind as Cale pulled Clara into the storming night. The sky stretched wide and endless, painted in bruised purples and copper fire as lightning flickered across the horizon. Sand lashed against her veil, stinging her cheeks, and the hem of her white dress snagged on mesquite thorns as they ran. "Wait!" Clara gasped, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the wind. Her lungs burned, her slippers slipping in the dust, but Cale's hand was firm around hers, steady as iron. Behind them, the chapel doors burst open. Shouts filled the night, angry voices barking orders. Gunshots cracked, flashes of fire sparking. In the darkness, Clara flinched as a bullet whined past, splintering the wooden post of a corral. Cale yanked her behind the cover of a rocky outcrop. His chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, but his eyes dark, unshaken scanned the shadows. The storm rattled through his long black hair, tangling it across his face, the beads of his tribal jewelry glinting with each flash of lightning. Clara pressed against the stone, her heart racing so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "They'll kill us," she whispered, voice trembling. "My father Hiram, they'll never let us go." Cale turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "You are free," he said simply, voice deep, resolute. The storm carried his words like an oath. Her throat tightened. Free, a word she had never dared to claim. But there was no time to dwell. Hoofbeats thundered from the chapel yard. Men mounted on Lawson's horses were coming fast, lanterns swinging in the darkness like angry fireflies. Their curses tore through the storm. Cale caught her arm, pulling her toward a waiting horse hidden in the shadow of the rocks. It was a powerful paint stallion, muscles rippling, nostrils flaring against the wind. With one smooth motion, Cale lifted her onto the saddle before leaping up behind her. His arms bracketed her, strong and unyielding, and she felt the raw heat of him through the thin fabric of her dress. "Hold," he said, wrapping one of her hands around the reins. Before she could answer, the stallion lunged forward, hooves pounding against the desert floor. Clara clung to the horse's mane, the wind tearing her veil away into the night like a ghost. Her dress whipped and snagged, but Cale's arm around her waist kept her anchored, safe amid the chaos. The pursuers gave chase, shouts rising with every gunshot that cracked the air. Sparks lit the desert as bullets struck stone. The stallion surged faster, muscles coiled with power, weaving between jagged rocks and thorny brush. Clara felt the world blur into sound and motion, the roar of the storm, the pounding of hooves, the fierce rhythm of her heart against Cale's chest. At last, the lantern lights began to fade behind them. Cale urged the stallion up a steep incline, the trail narrowing between boulders until it opened onto a high ridge. From there, the land stretched wide and wild beneath the storm. Endless desert, dotted with mesas that rose like sleeping giants. They slowed to a halt, both heaving for breath. Lightning split the sky, illuminating Cale's face, his jaw set with determination, his eyes smoldering as they scanned the land below for signs of pursuit. His chest glistened with sweat and rain, every muscle taut with readiness. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the saddle horn. She turned to him, words tumbling out before she could stop them. Why? Why risk everything for me? Cale met her gaze, and for a moment, the storm seemed to hold its breath. Because your heart called, he said simply. He reached to his neck, fingers brushing the feather charm he had shown in the chapel. I gave this to you. You carry me. I carry you. Her breath caught, tears stinging her eyes. All the walls built by duty, by her father's commands, by the town's expectations, cracked beneath the weight of those words. She opened her mouth to speak, but a distant shout carried on the wind. The riders had not given up. Lanterns flickered. Again in the distance, bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps as they climbed the trail, Cale leaned close, his breath warm against her ear despite the cold storm. We ride to my people. There, they cannot take you. Her chest tightened with fear and longing all at once. To leave the only life she had known, to vanish into a world the town called savage, it was madness. Yet as Cale urged the stallion forward once more, Clara realized something terrifying and beautiful. Madness had never felt so much like freedom. The storm carried them through the night like fugitives borne on the back of thunder. Cale's stallion moved with unyielding strength, hooves striking sparks from the desert stone as it carried them away from the world Clara had always known. The town lights were long gone now, swallowed by distance and darkness. Only the storm remained, wrapping them in rain and wind until every trace of her old life was scoured from her skin by dawn. The tempest had broken. The sky softened into pale hues of rose and gold as the sun climbed above the mesas. Clara stirred in the saddle, her body aching from the ride, her wedding dress torn and filthy. Cale guided the stallion into a canyon where sheer walls of red stone rose around them, sheltering them from the wind. The air smelled of damp earth and sage. Fresh after the storm. At last, he slowed the stallion and helped her down. His touch was steady, grounding, though his silence weighed heavy. Clara steadied herself against the rocks, her legs trembling from exhaustion. She studied him as he loosened the reins and patted the stallion's neck, whispering words in Navajo. Even stripped of sleep, his presence filled the canyon-broad shoulders, bronze skin gleaming with sweat, hair falling in dark, wet strands around his face. The tribal jewelry across his chest caught the dawn light like small flames. He looked both human and more than human, carved by the land itself. Clara drew her arms around herself, shivering in her torn gown. Questions burned on her tongue. Why did you come? How can you protect me? What will my father do? But only one managed to escape. Where are we going? Her voice was small in the vast canyon. Cale met her eyes, his gaze unreadable. Home. The word settled in her chest like a stone thrown into deep water. Home. But not hers. His Cale gestured for her to follow, leading the stallion down a narrow trail that twisted between boulders. The sun grew brighter, painting the canyon walls in fire. At the far end, the passage opened into a hidden valley. Clara stopped, breath caught in her throat. A village lay nestled among cottonwood trees and red cliffs. Smoke curled from fire. Pits and round, earthen hogans dotted the land. Children ran barefoot in the dust, their laughter echoing against the stone. Women carried baskets of corn and herbs, while men worked with horses near corrals. Life, simple yet strong, pulsed through the valley. Cale raised his hand in greeting as they approached, but the villagers froze at the sight of Clara. Conversations faltered, eyes turned sharp, whispers rippled through the crowd. A white woman, dressed in tatters of silk and lace, Stumbling into their sacred place, it was as though a hawk had landed among doves. Clara's stomach tightened. She clutched, her ruined dress suddenly feeling smaller than ever. Every stare pressed against her like judgment. She had always been an outsider in her own town, but here she was something else entirely, an intruder. An elderly woman stepped forward, her braids silver, her face lined with wisdom and years. Her eyes narrowed on Clara, then flicked to Cale. She spoke in Navajo, her tone sharp, questioning. Cale answered in the same tongue, his voice low but firm. Clara caught none of the words, but she felt the tension in the air, curiosity, disapproval, even fear. Finally, the elder's gaze softened just slightly, and she nodded once before turning back toward the Hogans. Cale led Clara after her, speaking quietly at her side. "This is my grandmother, Yiska. She is head of the family. She will decide." Decide. "What?" Clara whispered, dread knotting in her stomach. "If you can stay." The words hit her harder than a gunshot. Stay. As if her life were a question to be weighed and measured. She glanced back at the villagers, their wary eyes following her every step. Her father had cast her aside for land and cattle. Now Cale's. People might cast her aside for being the wrong color, the wrong blood. Inside the Hogan, the air was warm and thick with the scent of cedar smoke. Yiska sat cross-legged on a blanket, her dark eyes gleaming in the firelight. Cale motioned for Clara to kneel beside him. For a long moment, silence hung heavy. The elder studied her, gaze piercing, as though stripping away every layer of fear and pride. Then she spoke, her voice soft but certain, the Navajo words flowing like river water. Cale translated slowly. She says, "You stand between two worlds. One will hunt you. The other does not yet trust you." She asks, his eyes lifted to hers, steady, searching, "If your heart is strong enough to walk this path." Clara's throat ached. She thought of the chapel, of Lawson's hand crushing. Hers, of her father's cold command. She thought of Cale's arm pulling her free, of the storm carrying her away, of the word free on his lips. Her answer trembled, but it was clear. Yes. The elder's eyes narrowed, then softened, as if she had found what she sought. She spoke. Again, and Cale gave a single nod. She says, "Then you may stay." For the first time since the bells tolled in that chapel, Clara felt her lungs fill without chains. Yet deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. For Hiram Lawson would not rest, and the storm she had fled would one day find its way here. Clara woke to the sound of drums. They were faint at first, a low, steady rhythm that echoed against the red canyon walls. She stirred on the blanket where she had slept, the Hogan dim but warm with the lingering scent of cedar smoke. Her dress was still torn and stained from the wedding, a pitiful remnant of the life she'd left behind. When she stepped outside, the early sun lit the village in hues of copper and gold. Children ran laughing through the dust, their voices sharp as birdsong. Women worked with baskets of corn and herbs, while men tended horses in the corrals. The drums came from a group gathered near the center of the village, where an older man tapped out a slow beat on a handmade drum, teaching the rhythm to boys who tried to follow. Life moved with purpose here, steady and unbroken. Yet every time Clara's eyes met those of a villager, the rhythm faltered. Conversations hushed, stares lingered. Whispers followed her like shadows. Some eyes were cold, others curious, but none were welcoming. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the weight of her difference. Back in town, she had never belonged, either too soft, too hesitant, always bound by her father's demands. But here, she was something else entirely, an intruder, a reminder of a world that had taken more from these people than it ever gave. Cale emerged from the shadows of the Hogan behind her. Shirtless, the morning light gilded the bronze plains of his chest. the turquoise and bone pendants resting against him like sacred armor. His long black hair was tied back loosely, strands falling across his face as he regarded her with calm intensity. "They do not trust," he said simply, as though reading her thoughts. Clara's lips trembled. "I can see that." "They remember." He continued, "White men have burned our homes, taken our land, stolen our children. You walk with me, but to them you are still of that world." His words stung because they were true. Clara lowered her eyes. "Then why bring me here at all? Why risk your people's anger?" Cale stepped closer, so near she could feel the warmth radiating from him. His voice dropped low, almost a growl. "Because I will not leave you for Lawson. Because I will not let chains claim your spirit. And because," his hand brushed the feather charm tied around his chest, "I believe the spirits placed you in my path." Her heart stuttered, caught between fear and the fierce pull in his words. But before she could answer, a sudden cry rose from the edge of the village. A scout galloped in on horseback, dust billowing around him. The villagers gathered as he dismounted quickly, words pouring out in Navajo. The people stiffened, faces grim. Clara glanced at Cale. His jaw hardened. "Lawson's men. They ride the valley. They search." Her chest tightened. Of course Lawson would come. He would not suffer the humiliation of being defied, and her father— She shivered, knowing his anger would burn just as hot. The villagers began speaking urgently, some voices rising in anger. Clara didn't need to understand the language to know what they argued. Her presence had brought danger to their door. A group of men looked at her with open hostility, hands hovering over knives at their belts. Fear knifed through her, but Cale stepped in front of her, his body a shield. His voice rang out in Navajo, sharp and commanding, cutting through the commotion. The elder Yiska appeared, her silver braids glinting in the sunlight, and raised her hand. Silence fell. She spoke slowly, her eyes fixed on Clara, her tone grave but not unkind. Cale translated, his voice softer now. "She says, the choice is yours. If you leave now, perhaps Lawson takes you back. The village is safe. If you stay, you put us all in danger. But if your heart is true, then you must prove it." Clara's breath caught. "Prove it?" Her hands trembled. "How?" Cale's gaze softened. "You must walk with them, work with them. Show your spirit is strong, not weak. Only then will they see you are not his." Her throat tightened. She thought of the chapel, of the chains disguised as vows. She thought of running, always running. No more. Slowly, she lifted her chin, meeting Yiska's gaze across the gathering. "Tell her I will prove it," she whispered. Cale translated, and for the first time, a faint smile touched the elder's lips. But Clara's heart still pounded, for she knew the truth. Hiram Lawson's men were drawing closer with every mile. And when they came, she would not only have to prove herself to Cale's people, she would have to fight for her life. The night was unnervingly still, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote echoing through the mesas. Clara sat near the fire, her fingers gripping the edge of her dress as though it might anchor her to some familiar truth. She had not slept, not even when Cale urged her to rest. The memory of torches on the ridge haunted her, shadows moving against the sky, faceless riders scouring the desert. Her father would not rest, not when he believed his daughter stolen like cattle from a pen. Cale crouched by the doorway of the hogan, bare chest glistening with the sheen of firelight. His long black hair spilled forward as he leaned into the night, eyes fixed on the horizon with the sharpness of a hawk. Tribal jewelry shifted on his skin bone and turquoise rattling softly as he inhaled the scent of smoke carried on the desert. Wind. Clara studied him, both terrified and strangely comforted by his presence. He was more than a man, she thought. He was the earth itself, unyielding, eternal, impossible to bend. "They're close," he murmured in Navajo before switching to English so she could understand. "Your father's men. By sunrise, they will reach the canyon." Her stomach twisted. "Then you should let me go," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "If you send me back, perhaps no blood will be spilled." Cale turned then, eyes narrowing, his strong jaw clenched with quiet ferocity. "No, you are not theirs to claim. You are not a horse to be traded, nor a prize to be forced into a man's bed. They will come for you, but they will face me first." Clara's chest ached with conflicting emotions. He spoke with such conviction, such fire, that she almost believed she was worth defending. But fear gnawed at her. Her father's anger, the town's judgment, the clash of two worlds that seemed destined to end in blood. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Cale rose, his towering form casting a shadow against the curved earthen walls. He moved to a chest in the corner and pulled out a spear, its tip glinting with obsidian. The weapon seemed ancient, sacred, carrying the weight of his peoples. Battles across generations. He traced a finger down its shaft as though grounding himself in the strength of his ancestors. "Will you kill them?" Clara asked, her voice fragile. Cale paused, then looked at her with the solemnity of a man who had lived through too much loss. "Only if they force my hand. Blood is not spilled for glory, it is spilled for survival. But if they seek to chain you, to bind you against your will, then yes, I will stand and I will not fall." The words sank deep into her, stirring a warmth she didn't want to name. For the first time in her life, someone was willing to fight for her, not her dowry, not her obedience, not the honor of a family name. Just her. A sudden cry rang out from the canyon, rim-sharp, distant, and unmistakably human. Clara jumped, her pulse racing. Cale was already moving, silent as a panther, slipping through the doorway into the cool desert night. Clara followed, the chill air biting her skin as she stepped outside. On the far ridge, torches flared like angry stars. Riders moved in a slow line, their horses kicking up dust even under the moon's pale light. She could almost see her father. Among them, his broad hat casting shadows over a face carved in fury. Cale lifted his spear and pressed it into the earth before him, the firelight glinting off the tribal jewelry across his chest. "They have found us," he said quietly. Clara's knees weakened, her heart hammering. This was it, the world colliding, the fragile line between her old life and this new, uncertain path shattering in the desert air. She thought of her father's, hand gripping hers as a child, of her mother's prayers whispered over her, of the laughter she had once shared with her sisters in the homestead kitchen. And now she thought of Cale, standing like an unbreakable stone against the night, his presence both terrifying and safe. The torches began their descent into the canyon. Horses whinnied. The sound of gun metal clinked faintly, carried by the wind. Clara clutched the folds of her dress, breathing hard. Cale looked back at her, eyes burning with something fierce, something unspoken. "Stay behind me," he ordered, and, though her blood ran cold with fear, Clara nodded, stepping closer to him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. The desert was holding its breath. The war for her freedom was about to begin. The night burned with the weight of choices, every star above a silent witness to the fragile line between love and war. Clara's pulse thrummed in her ears as she crouched behind the sandstone, torn between fear and awe. Below, the men her father's men were shouting her name, their torches bobbing like angry spirits, their rifles catching glints of firelight. They believed she was stolen. But in truth, Clara felt something deep in her chest whispering otherwise. Cale, the warrior who had risked everything, stood tall against the ridge. His broad bronze shoulders gleamed under the moon, muscles rigid with determination. His long, Black hair spilled down his back like a river of night, tribal jewelry clinking softly as he moved. He was shirtless, but clothed in something far stronger, unyielding defiance. With his bow drawn taut, he looked like he belonged to the earth and the heavens at once, a man forged by the land itself. "Stay low," he whispered, his voice calm but edged with steel. "They will try to smoke us out, but the ridge favors." "U.S." Clara pressed her hand to the stone, her heart aching. "Cale," she breathed, her voice trembling. "If they find us, they'll kill you." His dark eyes met hers, unwavering, unafraid. "Then I will die knowing I fought for what is true. But tonight," his gaze softened, "just for her. Tonight, you must choose who you are, Clara, their bride or mine." The words struck her like lightning. She could hear the echo of wedding bells still ringing in her mind, the vows forced into her throat earlier that day. She remembered the cold gold band, the lifeless hand of the man she had been given to. And now here Cale, who had risked his tribe's wrath and her family's guns for her freedom. The men below began to climb the canyon wall, their boots scraping, voices cursing in the wind. Cale notched an arrow, released, and the shaft thudded into the ground inches from a man's foot. A warning. "Go home." Cale's voice rolled like thunder across the stone. "She is not yours." Clara's father's voice rang back sharp and furious. "She's my daughter, and should do as I say." His torchlight carved his face into something both familiar and monstrous. "You think you can take her from me? She belongs where I put her." Clara's breath caught. The words clawed at her like chains, the old chains she had always worn. But tonight she felt them break. She rose, trembling but resolute, stepping out from behind the boulder. Her white dress fluttered like a ghost in the moonlight. "Father!" she cried, her voice echoing across the canyon. Every torch paused. Every man froze. "I will not go back. I will not be his bride. I will not be your bargaining chip. One choose my own life." The silence that followed was suffocating. She could hear her own heartbeat, the crackle of torches, the shifting of horses below. Her father's face twisted, his voice breaking into a roar. "You're bewitched. That savage has poisoned you." But Clara cut him off, her voice clear and sharp. "No, he gave me freedom. He gave me choice, something you never did." Cale lowered his bow slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. The moonlight lit her face, and in it he saw her spirit awaken. He reached for her hand, and she took it tightly, without hesitation. Her father lifted his rifle. The men behind him followed suit. The air grew thick, every second stretched like a blade waiting to fall. Clara felt Cale's hand squeeze hers. Strong, steady. She whispered, "If this is the end, I face it with you." But Cale only shook his head. "No," he murmured. "This is the beginning." From the far ridge, a sound shattered the tension, the sharp cry of a hawk. Then, out of the darkness, shapes emerged. Dozens of Navajo warriors, silent as shadows, fanned across the high rocks above, bows drawn, spears glinting. They had come not to rebuke Cale, but to stand with him, to protect their own. Clara's father stared, his defiance faltering as he realized they were outnumbered, outmatched, outwilled. One by one, his men lowered their rifles, their torches wavering. The canyon fell still, except for the whisper of wind. Cale stepped forward, his chest rising with every breath, his voice deep and final. "She is not yours to give. She is hers to choose." He turned to Clara, his hand warm against hers. "And she has chosen." Tears blurred her vision as she nodded, her voice trembling but strong. "I have. I choose you, Cale." The warriors on the ridge let out a low, resonant chant, the sound of earth and sky joining in witness. Clara's father's torch fell too. The dirt, the fire hissing as it died. He turned away, shoulders heavy, and mounted his horse without another word. His men followed, shadows retreating into the desert night. Clara leaned against Cale, her heart pounding with relief and wonder. The war was over before it had begun. And as the warriors vanished into the darkness, leaving them alone beneath the stars, she realized her life was no longer bound in chains of duty. It was hers, fierce and unbroken. Cale brushed a strand of hair from her face, his voice low. "Now you are free." Clara looked into his eyes, her chest swelling with something she had never known before. Not fear, not duty, but love. "No," she whispered, a smile breaking through her tears. "Now we are free." And with the desert wind at their backs, the warrior and the bride stepped down from the ridge into a future written not by others, but by their own hearts.